dispensa. Sorry, technical difficulties. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Independent Guåhan's General Assembly. My name is Francine Napati, and I'm one of the co-chairs for the EDR group over in Independent Guåhan. So today our panel will be discussing how our culture can be included when treating and healing our communities. A lot of our people suffer from violence within their families, and so we have a great group of panelists who will be here to share with you the work they've been doing to kind of help our families towards healing and bringing peace to their familial environments and within our community at large. So we usually like to start out our general assemblies with the Inifresi. So if you can all just follow along. Inifresi ginini mastakilo gihinasoko I mastakalum gi corazonhu zani masfigu nani nasinyahu hu ufresin maisazo para bai hu protegi zan hu defendi I hinengi I cultura I lenguaje I airi I hanum zanitano tamoro ni irin shoko riretu gininazu sata esi hu afitma gihilu I biblia zani bandirahu I benderan Guåhan. So I'd like to introduce my co-chair, Victoria Lola Leon Guerrero, and she's gonna, I'm sorry. First, before we begin, I'd like you all to, for those of you who are new to our General Assembly, and even for some of you who may have come to our General Assemblies or events in the past, Independent Guåhan is a community organization. So what we seek to do is to empower the Chamorro people to reclaim our sovereignty as a nation. And we do this by being inspired by the strength of our ancestors, and with love for future generations, we educate and unify all who call our island home to build a sustainable and prosperous independent future. So with our General Assembly, I'd now like to introduce my co-chair, Victoria Lola Leon Guerrero, and she'll talk to you a bit about some of IG's events, especially one of our larger events that just happened this past July.
Half the day. Sizo Ismaasi Francine for the wonderful introduction, and to all the guests that are joining us today. Independent Guåhan, our sole purpose, as Fran mentioned, is to educate the community. And so we've been really exploring during these the time of this pandemic ways that we can reach out in new mediums. And so we're doing that here today through our online General Assembly, but also starting this Saturday, we will be hosting a radio program on Hit Radio 100 for every Saturday in September from 4 to 5 p.m. And so this Saturday, we will be talking about who we are as an organization and what we do. On September 12th, we will do some education about decolonization. On the 19th, we'll go through an Independence 101, so looking at the most frequently asked questions and our responses to them about independence and its possibilities for our future. And then on September 26th, we will be listening to some incredible independent sounds from some talented local musicians. And this really follows after another major event that we did in July. Every year we've hosted a Songs of Freedom concert around July 4th, either on July 4th or in the month of July, really reframing our notions of independence and Independence Day. And we've had the incredible honor of hosting many different types of musicians from different genres, all with the same message of wanting a better future for Guåhan, a decolonized future for Guåhan, an independent future for Guåhan. And so this year we were very excited to move the concert on air and online. And so on July 11th, we hosted the concert through KUAM. So it aired live on Channel 8 and then also online. And online, it received over 17,000 views. So thank you to all of you for tuning in. It was a wonderful experience. There were many different kinds of musicians and poets, but also a bunch of young people sharing the quotes of our Magat Tautau, our heroes in our history. Their voices really guided us through the program. And so it's not too late to catch the concert. You can actually still watch it on KUAM if you go to to YouTube and then you go to the KUAM News channel. I've circled in this image where you can find the Songs of Freedom playlist. So the homepage of their channel, if you look down where it says playlist, the Natlatla Songs of Freedom Volume 4, if you click there are links to the concert that you can enjoy. So I hope that if you didn't check it out, please do. Me and my kids like to just have it in the background at the house, listening to all that beautiful music. So please enjoy. Lastly, we hold our general assemblies on the last Thursday of every month, kind of due to the island's shutdown and just some transitions we're all making. We're hosting it this month on the first Thursday, but we'll resume to our regular schedule this month, and our next General Assembly will be on Thursday, September 24th. In the same way, we will be broadcasting through Independent Guåhan's Facebook Live page. But I wanted to just kind of share a little bit about what our General Assembly is and what we're going to be doing today. So our General Assembly is the one time a month that Independent Guåhan has consistently used to check in with the community. So we update on our work, but we also want to educate in every single effort that we do. And so typically we pick a topic that either is really pressing in the community at the moment, or we pick topics that people regularly ask us about, and we do research and we present models to really answer people's questions. But this year, kind of every year for Independent Guåhan, we reset after our concert and kind of evaluate our efforts. And so for this year, we really wanted to take a look at, well, what are the things that are happening in our community that are already acts of decolonization and acts of independence? That a lot of times, one of the biggest critiques we hear about independence is, how can we be independent? We can't even take care of ourselves now. We hear that all the time, and it's really disheartening, especially for those of us that see the incredible work happening in our community. And so today we wanted to address an issue that is very pressing, that we hear about almost daily, violence in our community, and really look at the ways in which our therapists, our doctors, our community workers, our social workers are really trying to approach this issue through a cultural context. And so Dr. Napati, Fran, my co-chair, will introduce our first guest.
Thank you, Lola. So our first panelist will be Terilynn Francisco. And so Terry is a licensed clinical social worker with the state of Hawaii and Guam social work boards. She is a certified grief recovery specialist and the mental health first aid trainer. She works at Guam Behavioral Health and Wellness Center in the adult counseling program and now works with veterans at the Guam Vet Center, specializing in military sexual trauma. She is also the co-Manietlu or president of Ihagan Familauan Guåhan, the Chamorro Women's Association. So welcome, Terry, and thank you for joining us and agreeing to speak to Independent Guåhan.
Sizois Maasi, Fran, Lola, and Maget for organizing tonight's event. I believe we wanted to start by honoring our Maget Tautau that we've chosen to recognize tonight. So the overall title of our presentation will be Deconstructing Violence in Our Community, the Value of Culturally Based Interventions in Treatment and Healing. So to start off, let's honor our Maget Tautau, Dr. Lisa Baza. She is a licensed professional counselor, a licensed marriage and family therapist, a licensed mental health counselor. Dr. Baza holds a Bachelor of Science degree in criminal justice, a Master of Arts in counseling, and a doctorate in human services with a counseling specialization. Dr. Baza has worked in the field of behavioral health for approximately 25 years. She has held several positions at the Superior Court of Guam as a juvenile probation officer, adult drug court coordinator, counseling intern, individual marriage and family therapist, and presently has a senior judicial therapist with client family services and counseling. Dr. Baza specializes in trauma-focused treatment interventions in the field of intervention. She is also certified as a co-parenting coordinator, a bullying prevention trainer, and a telebehavioral health provider. Dr. Baza's work experience at the judiciary includes working with women domestic violence survivors in the Thrive group, with child survivors and witnesses of domestic violence in the Kids group, and with male offenders and victims in the Stop Family Violence Men's group and the MRT Domestic Violence group. Dr. Baza's caseload is comprised mostly of adolescent survivors of sexual assault and family violence. Viva Dr. Baza, our maggot telltale for this event. Thank you for honoring us tonight.
Thank you more. Sidus Masi to Independent Guåhan, to Professor Francisco, Dr. Santos, and to Ms. Meno, who will be presenting this evening. I am excited about the topic. Learning about culturally proficient healing, especially in this time, is really needed. So it's a huge topic. And a lot of what you talk about in your presentation are supported by other evidence-based practices. So thank you very much for your work. I also, I am humbled for the honor. I just want to recognize, two of the pioneers who started off with at Client Services and Family Counseling, who started the first Women's Survivors Group, the Thrive Group. And it is the late Ann Harden and Dr. Kelly Sicola. So they're like our pioneers in this field, at least for women survivors. And I want to honor them also. So Daklina Sizus Maasi, and I will be listening attentively. Thank you again.
Dr. Baza. Independent Guåhan, every month we honor a maggot telltale whose work really exemplifies the act of decolonization and whose life is really an inspiration to us all. And I worked most closely with Dr. Baza on the Commission on Decolonization. And so on top of that impressive bio that we just heard and the incredible work that she does in our community for our families, she also very much dedicates her time as well to efforts of decolonization, and it was an honor to serve with you on the commission. And so without further ado, I'd like to also now introduce the rest of our presenters. And so joining Professor Terilynn Francisco is Cameron Meno, who is the daughter of Levon Guerrero Meno and Anthony Meno. She is a doctoral candidate, so soon to be Dr. Cameron Meno herself, in the Clinical Community Psychology program at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her program of research focuses on explicating and empowering community understandings of and responses to social problems, such as gender-based violence, suicide, and colonization. Born and raised in Guåhan, Cameron seeks to return home upon completion of her degree to support the island's capacity for mental health services by conducting culturally relevant research and intervention on island. Our next presenter is Dr. Edward Santos, who is the director of the Guam Vet Center, U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs. He received his degree from Palo Alto University, formerly Pacific Graduate School of Psychology, and has worked previously with Guam Behavioral Health and Guam Department of Education. His family is from the village of Asan, and he is married to Miss Nadine Cepeda. We are very honored to have you both as our presenters. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
Can we go back one slide to our outline? All right, so for tonight's presentation, Cameron and Dr. Santos and I will be discussing forms of violence, the intersectionality of violence, the core mechanisms of violence, some of the risk factors for violence, the historical context of violence on Guam, with the collective violence on Guam and our mass exposures through time, a contemporary context of violence on Guam, with some family violence trends, current family violence trends. We'll then go into trauma and stressor related disorders, focusing on post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we'll head into treatment and the Native idea of historical trauma from a Chamorro cultural lens, intergenerational trauma, how we inherit trauma, and then we will go into further trauma treatment. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are different forms of violence that one can be exposed to throughout their lifetime, starting with child maltreatment from early adulthood to adolescence. There's also bullying and youth violence, also from early adulthood to adolescence. And then we reach dating violence and intimate partner violence. This is also where family violence or domestic violence falls under, from late adolescence, teens to adulthood and late adulthood. And then we have sexual violence, which unfortunately falls throughout the spectrum, the developmental spectrum, from early adulthood, adolescence, all the way into late adulthood. And at the bottom, we have war and other collective violence. And we're going to be discussing the collective violence that we've been exposed to as a community and how that trickles down into our households and our families, right? And at the top there, there's elder maltreatment, which is along the span of late adulthood.
And one of the things that's really important is that violence can also be psychological and physical. So sometimes the the psychological scars are as hurtful and as dangerous as a physical scar. And then also in terms of development, each one of these types of violence impact all the different types of development, the stages of development. So if you have something in mild maltreatment in early childhood, it can stop part of the development, early childhood. Or if you have something in adolescence, the sexual violence can also impact the development.
Next slide, please. Okay, so here we have an intersectionality of violence. And when we talk about violence, abuse, we're really looking at the core of it, power and control, right? And that's really the mechanism that drives a perpetrator to commit violent acts, right? So all the different forms of violence we just discussed, as well as human trafficking listed here, they're all driven by the perpetrator's desire to achieve power and control over the victim.
And also with this diagram, it's very important to note that every part of that intersects, there is an interaction. So child abuse also interacts with family violence. Sexual assault also interacts with human trafficking. So it's all interrelated. And like she just said, in the middle, there's power of control.
Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to go into some of the risk factors for violence upon those different levels, right? So in the individual level, some of the risk factors are victims of child maltreatment. The individual may have a psychological, a mental health condition, or another alcohol or substance abuse condition, or a personality disorder that makes them more vulnerable to being victimized. On the level of couples or domestic violence, they're more susceptible to having conflict or marital discord. They may have poor parenting practices or conflict in child rearing practices or ideas or beliefs. They may come from a low socioeconomic household status, which triggers the family itself to be vulnerable because they have a lack of access to resources. Or they may have friends or other family members that are engaged in violence or the cycle of violence. So it's normalized. Some risk factors for the community at the community level. Of course, we see poverty again, right? So again, talking about not having access to resources or needs that families or households need to survive. right? Resorting to substances, right? A high local drug trade, right, to meet their needs or to self-medicate. High unemployment rates, and with this comes other weak institutional policies that don't provide a good safety net for the families in the community. And then on the societal level, so collectively, of course, the rapid social change is definitely a risk factor for violence. Rapid social change creates a form of oppression, right? If families or people are not able to adapt to new circumstances appropriately or given the means to do so in a healthy way. Again, economic disparities, inequalities, all forms of gender inequality as well, right? Again, that represents the power and control struggle, cultural norms that support violence, and high firearm availability can also be another risk factor, right? Because there's a higher possibility of harm if there's lethal means that are accessible.
And one of the things with this slide, remember that all the factors interact. So an individual level, the couple level, community, and societal level, all of them have an interaction, like a multivariate impact to come up with the risk factors. And nothing happens by itself. So if there's something going on in a community, think about how it's going to impact the couple and the society and the individual.
Next slide, please.
Okay,
So this is,
so in addition, sorry, go ahead. Okay, so in addition to examining the different forms of violence and the risk factors for violence, it's also important to understand how violence occurs across time and cultural periods, to understand kind of like how we're getting to where we're at, right? What are the trends we're seeing today? So in some of the research I've done, specifically looking at violence against women in our historical context in Guam, I saw that some of our earliest written records of the Mariana Islands indicated that violence was rare in Guam, which is similar to patterns that we observe in other indigenous communities around the world, where violence against women is rare and men and women seem to have similar roles in society and share a lot of power and responsibility. In fact, colonial documents in Guam highlighted the unique power and status of women, particularly in comparison to what some of the missionaries saw in Spanish culture. And these writers described community-based sanctions that help protect women from violence in some of our earliest histories. So perhaps one of the earliest colonial documents written about the Mariana Islands from Fray Juan Pobre wrote that Chamorro women could leave their partners if they mistreated them. Specifically, Pobre said that if the Chamorro woman was unhappy with her partner, she could leave her home, take her children and all her belongings, and return after the husband or partner and his extended family made formal apologies and begged the woman to return. So as you could see, there was this very strong kind of community-based response, and women were free to leave if they wanted to, and they were supported by their families. So that's something really beautiful, I think, that the missionaries picked up when they came here and saw how different it was from Spanish culture. Over the course, though, of these 400 years of colonial contact, some researchers of Guam, including Laura Souder, have highlighted that these roles, right, and these sanctions that used to exist have changed. And that today we see that our gender roles have really modeled Spanish and now eventually US norms, which might explain the reason why we're seeing such high rates of violence against women today. Next slide, please.
Dispensa, Terry, I think you're muted.
Dispensa. So thank you, Cam. So now we really want to discuss the mass exposure to violence as a community throughout time, with this idea of collective violence on Guåhan, right? And just like Cam discussed earlier in our history books, right, we've researched, and naturally, right, we don't feel like we're culturally a very violent people, right? And you know, in the history books, it shows that when there was conflict, like between clans, there would be 1 or 2 casualties, and then the elders would intervene and kind of resolve the disputes, right? So we didn't really come into very destructive mass exposure to violence until colonization, right? And so that begins, of course, in 1521 with the Spanish era, right? And here, of course, we all know that our population was dramatically reduced at this time. There are a lot of wars with the Spaniards, right? And there was also a lot of exposure to other means of death, right? So a lot of disease and illness, right? And you know, thinking back, I wanted to kind of highlight something that I did read. It was Vittoris that documented it, and it was when Spanish soldiers would raid Chamorro homes, collect the skulls for ancestral veneration, and trample on them in the course of battle in order to really affect and disable the Chamorro warriors, right? And I wanted to highlight that because later we're going to talk about how the spirit gets wounded in battle, right? And that just that form of violence would really wound a Chamorro person, right? And they wouldn't even have to hurt them or touch them physically, because, you know, crushing the skull of our ancestors or their family, their loved ones, really disables us, right? And we all understand that culturally. And then we move into the naval administration, right? When Guam was ceded to the US from Spain in 1898. And this is important to highlight because this really demonstrates that we're enmeshed institutionally into violence, right? And the US naval government took care of, right? There was no local government at this time for the Chamorro people, right? And so we had an administrating power being an institution of war and violence. And then, of course, World War II, our Japanese occupation in 1941 to 44, right? And these are brutal acts of war and atrocity that we have direct living memory of, right? Our parents and our grandparents still tell of the violent atrocities that they experienced as a war being occupied at this time, right? So we're not looking at the distant past, right? We're really looking at how it's coming forth to the present. And then, you know, we were reoccupied. A lot of people felt that we were liberated again by the US, and this created, you know, a sense of safety and gratitude, right, to the US. And Guam saw after that some patriotism from our Chamorro community, which really increased rates of enlistment, right? And so after this, we have the Korean War and the Vietnam War, especially, right, that saw really high enlistment rates of Chamorro men. And then, you know, also Cam talked about how eventually we, our values changed, right? And at this time, we also started to move from an agricultural kind of sustaining community into more of a cash economy, right? And so land displacement as well also created a lot of economic disparities. And remember, we talked a lot about how that can be a really huge risk factor for violence, right? And so even today, most of the enlistment rates into the US military are because economic opportunities, right, and educational advancement, right? So it's really being a community that's disempowered and impoverished that facilitates our need to avail of the military institution, right? After this, around this time, we have abuse of youth by the clergy, right? So this is very important to note in our history, right? There were about 280 cases most recently filed against the Catholic Church, against the priests. And this is important to highlight because this is kind of a really large number of victims of sexual violence and sexual abuse in our community, right? Most of those people are still alive, right? And then we have, of course, the wars that lead us into the present, right? So the Persian Gulf in 1990, that's the invasion of Iraq. Somalia, which sees a lot of our veterans express experiencing a lot of aggression in that war. And then, of course, the global war on terrorism, 9/11 to the present.
And one of the things working with the veterans at the Vet Center is that we have third generation or even fourth generation. So a veteran's grandfather, grandfather might have been in the Guam militia. Their father was in World War II, or their grandfather World War II, and then they were their father was in Vietnam. So we have 3 or 4 generations, and we were on a documentary they call Guam the Island of Warriors, but actually it's a generation of generation that produced that type of exposure over the many years.
Yeah, just some numbers, right? So currently 1 out of 20 Guam residents is a military veteran. And in Iraq and Afghanistan, Guam's casualty rates have been 450% higher than the national average, right? So we're sending a lot of people to war, and a lot of our people are dying at war, right? And if you think 1 out of 20 veterans exist today, that's almost 1 soldier in every household, right? So we're all affected, right, by this issue. Next slide, please.
Okay, so again, my focus is on violence against women. So I wanted to share in the presentation today some research I've done exploring the contemporary context of violence against women in Guam. So from 2015 to 2016, I conducted a study with domestic violence advocates and first responders in Guam, asking them about their perspectives of violence against women in Guam, what they thought the causes were, and what solutions they thought we needed to really address this issue on island. So across these interviews, 4 main themes emerged regarding culture and violence against women in Guam, and these included 1, this idea of cultural loss and the negative effects of modernization and Western colonialism, really undergirding kind of our cases of violence against women on Guam, and that's kind of like the main reason. 2, ideas of cultural rigidity and the negative effects of rigid and outmoded gender and family roles that kind of prevent survivors from seeking help and prevent families from protecting survivors. 3, this idea of cultural revitalization, which I'm really excited to hear Professor Francisco and Dr. Santos talk a bit more. So how we can infuse cultural practices in the way that we respond. And I was really encouraged that the people I interviewed also saw that this should be a priority for our island. And finally, the last theme that came up, which was quite contentious, and I think is something that we're grappling with, is how we respond to violence against women in Guam and be aligned with kind of US-based practices and laws that really kind of shape how we respond today. So much of how we respond in Guam is modeled after the US, much like everything in Guam, right? But I think it's particularly interesting given, again, this sense of kind of cultural loss and this like influence of Western ideas, and holding those two together really came through in the interview. Next slide, please. Okay, so going over the first theme. So this was a very dominant theme. Majority of my participants highlighted this as a central issue, stating that the threat of cultural losses to the Chamorro language, to Chamorro practices, to the way that families gather was really kind of a barrier and really affecting the race that we see today. And many participants, again, saw a direct link between these issues and the race that we're seeing of violence against women in Guam. A few participants specifically pointed to the loss of traditional gender roles as factors relating to violence against women, highlighting the inconsistency of our contemporary norms that place men at the center of the household compared to what we used to do as a society in some of our earliest histories that were captured by the Spanish missionaries who first came here. So really kind of seeing this loss and seeing its effects on the family. Next slide, please. And so the next theme was cultural rigidity. And so I thought this was also really interesting because while a majority of the participants talked about the impacts of cultural loss, many participants also discussed this issue of this like rigidness in terms of culture. And I use this term to describe the sense of inflexibility to social change and to like external influences that my participants were seeing. And so, for example, some of my participants described how some of the cultural norms on island against shaming the family could be harmful to survivors, right? And so if we think about this, this is what occurs when a survivor who experiences violence is scared to reach out and get help from an advocate or another first responder because they're afraid that it might make the family look bad. So my participants noticed that this was a troubling trend, and they also discussed how some of our Chamorro and Roman Catholic values of keeping the family together against all odds, or just together no matter what, could function also as a barrier to survivors getting help. And I want to highlight, I use cultural rigidity, and when people talked about this, they tended to say they're kind of fixed on traditional culture. But I think that's also an interesting way we talk about culture, because if you remember from the early slide about kind of our earliest histories, right? In some ways, the things I'm talking about aren't actually a reflection of our traditional culture, right? And if we think about, where these ideas are coming from, it seems like they might actually be coming from some of the experiences we as a community had in the earliest 20th century, right? With Guam's, takeover by the U.S., right? And so these seem like they might be connected to that. Next slide, please. Cultural revitalization. So again, I was really encouraged and excited to hear that a lot of advocates saw that this was an issue that needed to be addressed. Cultural revitalization efforts suggested by participants in the study included a number of strategies focusing on strengthening the Chamorro family and reintroducing some of those traditional gender roles. Again, traditional as in like early, like close to pre-contact history that really was evocative of our culture at that time. Next slide, please. Okay, and so the final theme. This final theme was really a theme of kind of tension. Tension inherent in our practices as a community when we respond to violence and also aligning with US-based practices and laws. So several of my participants saw the value of US education and what we call evidence-based practices in responding to violence, right? And in many ways, this is very adaptive, right? Because when our programs seek funding, when we seek grants, they're looking for these kind of catchphrases, right? They're looking for these evidence-based practices that are developed in the US, right? And so it's very practical for us as a community to kind of align in that way so that we can get resources that we need, right? And so a lot of advocates were kind of talking about this somewhat necessity. At the same time, again, right, when we look at some of the other themes I mentioned earlier, right, this was a tension because clearly part of the problem is this like imposition of kind of Western ideas. So trying to navigate that was seen as a difficulty. Many participants also saw the importance of assimilating immigrant communities on island to so-called US-based laws of Guam. And this was also a tension, right? And so sometimes participants would talk about the need for people to abide by our laws, which are modeled by the US. But that in itself could also play a role in harming different segments of our community and possibly contributing to stereotypes and discrimination against some members of our community. So taking a step back, looking at these 4 themes, it was really clear to me when I did this research that our local advocates see the power of culture and really want to highlight those elements of Chamorro culture that can strengthen us and protect our families, protect our loved ones, and work on those parts of our culture that might harm people and might prevent people from getting help. And also thinking about the ways that we can balance kind of our cultural values, balance maybe the needs that can get addressed by aligning with US customs, but also again, kind of bringing to the forefront what we need as a community to really address the underlying causes of violence in Guam. Next slide, please.
Okay, so in this slide, we're really highlighting and coming to terms with the level of collective violence and how it trickles down into the family violence in our homes, right? So these are on the left here are some trends of filings of domestic violence cases. And here we have the top offenses charged overall on the right. So this is according to 2019. We may have seen an increase in 2020 because there are more risk factors with families and COVID, right? So there's higher stress, unemployment. So there's definitely more risk factors introduced to already vulnerable families. So we probably are going to see a higher trend this year in family violence cases, right? But according to 2019, family violence was the highest recorded offenses, right? 377, followed by DUI. Assault is at 169, which is another form of violence. Possession of controlled substances at 150, right? Which is again related to violence, like we discussed before, and harassment at 138, which is another form of violence, right? So definitely, this is a pretty, it's very problematic in our community.
You know, one of the things about this slide too is all these interact together again. So, you know, a family violence might also have substance abuse issue, and they also have the issues of the alcohol as well. So everything is kind of interacting. And with the Veterans Treatment Court, it's interesting, we have people that have PTSD, but also they're brought in because of family violence. And the family violence is a result of their unhealed or unresolved PTSD, which was back from their deployment.
So definitely it's very interconnected, right? Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to kind of move into diagnosis and treatment. So these are different trauma and stressor related disorders, right? So we have reactive attachment disorder, disinhibited social engagement disorder, and various different forms of other adjustment disorders, right? And then we have the more commonly known or diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And so all of these trauma and stressor related disorders, they have to have the person been exposed to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or some form of sexual violence, right? And so this is where we kind of see, so the PTSD of the person is how all of on the level of collective exposure and violence, that's how it's starting to trickle down into family violence, into our families and our households, right? Because the person witnesses such atrocity and violence, it harms their spirit and their soul, and then they bring it home, right? And they're forced to try to cope with their families, and then we see the manifestation of all the other symptoms, right? So there are what are called intrusion symptoms, right? So these are re-experiencing symptoms. This is when the person relives the event in their mind, right? So it'll come in forms of flashbacks or nightmares, right? And then we have avoidance, right? So because the re-experiencing is so difficult for the person to manage and to cope with, it's very distressing psychologically. They have physical reactions to the re-experiencing symptom. They naturally, of course, want to avoid it, right? We try to avoid things in our lives that cause fear or cause pain or discomfort, right? And then we have negative alterations in cognition, right? So this is the person, that their belief systems really change because of the trauma, right? And mood alterations as well, right? So this is where anxiety, depression, and in PTSD, you'll see really high emotional dysregulation with anger, right? And anger kind of becomes this vehicle and this form for the person to try to regain a sense of power, right? So they'll kind of use their anger to motivate to try to regain power and control, right? So again, we talked about the dynamics of violence, and at the core of it is the perpetrators gaining of power and control over the victim, right? So if you're victimized, you're going to always struggle with needing control in your life, right? And then there's hyperarousal symptoms, right? So this is a hypervigilance. So with trauma, it's kind of like thinking that our very natural human instinct of fight, flight, or freeze response is activated because that person was in a life or death experience. And with the disorder, it's like they cannot deactivate that in their mind, right? So it's kind of an evolutionary thing, like a reaction, right, to the violence, right? And so they're always hyper aroused, they're always on edge, right? And then they're always afraid of what's going to trigger the re-experiencing or the memories.
And one of the parts that is not in the DSM-5 yet is the intergenerational trauma. So we talked about historical factors. So like we said, if we had somebody, father or grandfather was in World War II, and then the parents were in Vietnam, and now they're in Afghan or Iraq, it's intergenerational issues passing down that PTSD or intergenerational trauma.
Next slide, please. Okay, so that was that kind of like the clinical diagnosis of trauma, but we also wanted to focus on what happens to the spirit, how it's viewed in treatment. Again, you really have to understand that when someone experiences extreme violence or trauma, it really changes their construction of reality, right? So whatever they believed before, it can be dramatically changed after they experience the trauma, right? So how they believe, everything that they believe about themselves can be overgeneralized and changed, and everything that they believe about the world can also be affected, right? So there are 5 main themes, right? So there's power and control, like we discussed before, the person's self-esteem as well, right? So feeling dirty, feeling unworthy, those are common distorted beliefs about the self. Their trust is also dramatically changed, right? So they have a distrust of other people primarily. They have problems with intimacy, not being able to feel close to other people. And then they also have problems feeling safe, right? Of course, right, they've been victimized, right? So it's hard for them to trust and to feel like the world is a safe place again, right? and this is a quote by Duran. The native idea of historical trauma involves the understanding that the trauma occurred in the spirit or the soul, right? So he is a Native American practitioner, right, psychologist. But this is also true for a lot of indigenous cultures and also for Chamorros as well, right? So Chamorros also believe that you aren't your illness, right? So in Western thinking, you know, your medical condition is a part of you, but Chamorros don't believe that. They believe that it's more of a passing thing. They believe that, or we believe that it's more of an internal, like an internal suffering, right? And a lot of the treatment is focused on changing that, giving purpose to the suffering, right? A lot of Western treatment is also focused on just coping with the symptoms, right? But when we look at more indigenous practices, we're looking at really trying to realign that person with more positive, more healthy, more whole, a whole sense of well-being overall.
And going back a little bit to the soul, we had a seminar this morning with Richard Mooskamp, was one of our elders. He talked about the spirit being like a circle, and we have our circles in our soul of our family, of our generations. And what happens when our spirit is wounded is the circle is broken, or it needs to be strengthened. And so with our therapy, part of it is to develop and to strengthen the circle, strengthen that hoop. With trauma, a lot of times if there's a wound in the soul, then it gets filled with other things. And that'll be family violence, that'll be substance abuse, that'll be other types of oppressive, behaviors. So our idea with our therapy, and this is our generation, it's interesting, the 7th generation, is that we're going to have a healing of our circle, healing of our hoop, and our people, especially here. You see, this generation is the 7th generation, and those are the ones that are coming up to become the next leaders, and that's where the healing is coming from.
Yeah, so really understanding that the condition itself isn't your identity, right? And bringing it back to Chamorro culture, I did some work with Cirujanos with Zo'amti, right? And I remember watching them treat patients, and I had to ask one of the Zo'amti why she was always so angry, right, in her practice. And she said, I'm not angry at the patient. It has nothing to do with the patient. I'm angry with the person and the spirit that hurt them. Right, so her anger was directed at removing the evil, right, that the person was exposed to, right? So Chamorros do have that indigenous belief that we are not the condition, right, especially when it comes to trauma, that it's an evil spirit that has kind of come into our soul and that we need to cleanse from. Next slide, please. Okay, so talking a little bit more about what Dr. Santos mentioned, into the idea of intergenerational trauma, right? So how we inherit the trauma without having actually been exposed to it, right? So one of the ways is storytelling, right? And this is because, especially with indigenous cultures, we are very close to our caregivers, right, and our elders, right? And whatever they tell us, it becomes our story, right? And we identify with them in ways that make us believe that we are who they are, we are just like them, we look like them, we believe what they believe, right? And so in some way, their experiences become our experiences, right? And so if we're inheriting stories of disempowerment, of poverty, of struggle, right, then it kind of becomes, it really affects our sense of being and what we feel like we're capable of, right? I was at a conference once and I heard an Aboriginal woman from Australia say that she still weeps for her mother's 5-year-old self, right? And that really hit home for me, because it's how we also feel, right? We're so moved by the stories of our elders, right? And it's really because we love them so much that it's almost like it transcends time, right? Their pain transcends time when they tell us what they've experienced, right? Also, behaviors observed by children, right? So again, we discussed PTSD and how it manifests and how it changes the person's beliefs, their emotions, and then how they behave, right? So if they're really avoidant of triggers, or if they're isolating or they're depressed, then that affects you know, the people around them, their families, right? And so it could lead to neglect, right, of their children, because they're disassociating and they're not able to care for them appropriately or fully, right? Because they're just trying to cope with their symptoms, right? So a lot of those, you know, the neglect and the children having to raise themselves, they also absorb a lot of those behaviors through time, right? So fears, right, that our parents' fears can become our fears, right? And of course, violence becomes normalized, right? And we become more desensitized with violence, right? Being continuously exposed to it.
And again, I just want to make that last point. It's been prophesized that this generation, our generation, will be the ones that are going to heal the intergenerational trauma. And it's happening. I mean, look with this project, look what's going on. We have people educated coming back to help their communities. We're having people that are kind of saying no to this prophecy, I mean, to this violence, and now having a new type of outcome for themselves. So it's already been laid out for us that this will be the time for the healing for this generation.
Okay, next slide, please.
Treatment.
Okay, so moving more into trauma treatment, right? So it has to be holistic. And culture really is the lens of which we understand ourselves in the world, right? We understand things around us and it's interpreted through our cultural belief systems, right? And so that's why it's really important to take that into account when you're treating. So trauma treatment has to be really holistic, right? It has to involve cognition, it has to involve psychoeducation, teaching them about the symptoms, what's happening to them, what they're experiencing, and finding out what are all those distortions that have changed because of the trauma, and then replacing them, right? And then also trying to treat the spirits, right? So, you know, this looks like what we call holding space, right? That means that you do some energy work, right? So you allow the person to process, to process the experiences without fear, right? So a lot of times in Western treatment, if you're intensely dysregulated, then they'll stop the session, right? Or if you're too psychotic, right? Then they'll have to focus on stabilization, right? But with Chamorros, right? And a lot of other indigenous cultures, re-experiencing is kind of an opportunity to enter into the spirit realm, right? And when a person dreams, right? I mean, how many more people have woken up and said, oh, I dreamt about Nana, right? And then your mother says, she's visiting you, right? And this belief that in our dreams is a space for us to visit with spirits, right? And so if we're looking at nightmares, right, from the trauma, right, then it's kind of using this space for the person to reach out to the person that has passed, right? And with veterans and people who have experienced war, it's usually the most traumatic experience where they killed someone, right? And so it's giving space to even that spirit that had died, right? And talking to that spirit, and you know, telling your remorse, right, or how guilty you feel, and really trying to find peace with that spirit on that battlefield, right? So that is a part of the cultural intervention for treating trauma, right? Using the re-experiencing more as an opportunity, right, to enter into the spirit realm, right? Creating safety and trust, right? And loving the person, right? And a lot of clinicians don't say that, right? But really loving that person for their experience, and then loving them as a person of our community, right? Somebody that we know, that we can understand, and that we're close to, right? And with the energy work, right? That's when they're really dysregulated, taking their energy and changing it within yourself and offering out a more peaceful energy, and an energy of love and healing, right? And allowing that energy to enter into them and giving them more space for peace and healing. And then also prayer, right? So allowing a space for prayer, right? Because you ask them, right? So what do you do if the dead visits you, right? And a lot of them say, well, my nana used to pray, right? Or light a candle. So we'll do that, right? We'll do that in session. We'll light a candle and they'll pray, right? And it's really as simple as it was me or you out there, right? And my command was to kill you, right? To shoot, right? And every day I think about you, and you know, I really regret it, right? So that it can be as simple as that really helps them to address the trauma that they've experienced.
And working with indigenous cultures, my mom's adopted Lakota, and so we have a Sundance where is an opportunity to kind of enter the spirit world symbolically and make sacrifices for your people. And we have other ceremonies that have been around for thousands of years, and we use that as part of our healing. And listening to Mr. Mooskamp this morning, he said each one of us, you know, we have a obligation to be able to help our relatives and to be healthy, you know, as healers, or to be healthy as you know, other people working in the community, but also to understand that, you know, for us, we have this obligation deep down to return to our family and to our community and take care of those parts that were given to us. That's dope.
Okay, so that's really the end of our presentation, right? So just in summary, went over forms of violence. We went over power and control as the core of violence, risk factors to violence, what makes us a vulnerable community. Cam went over a lot of the historical context of violence and into contemporary context of violence. And then some of the family violence trends. We discussed what is trauma, how it manifests, and the native ideas of historical trauma and our Chamorro beliefs about trauma and the spirit and how it gets wounded. And then we talked about intergenerational trauma, and then trauma treatment. That's it, Sizuas Maasi, and I guess we'll just take some questions now.
If there are any questions.
Yes, we have a lot of questions. Thank you, panelists, and thank you for sharing how your clinical practices really emphasize this sort of collective way of healing, you know, by bringing in our support systems when someone goes through treatment. Because often when you go into therapy or when you see a clinician, it's very one-on-one. It's sort of you and the practitioner, and it's not really, you don't really talk about kind of your family or even consider bringing them in. So we do have a lot of questions, so I'm not sure we're going to get to all of them. Many of our community members are very interested in this, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that, as you guys said in your presentations, we have very high rates of violence here in Guam. And so one person asked if you can explain a bit more about power and control Many of you spoke about how for victims, there's this huge loss of power and control when these things happen to them. And so why would violence be a central motivation for perpetrators?
I'll take that one. Well, at least from what I've worked with, is sometimes violence is a way for the perpetrator or the individual to gain power and to gain control. And interesting enough, when you work with sometimes with a parent, you'll see the same type of behavior in the children, that they learned that the violence was a way to take power and control. That's one way to look at it.
And if I may add to that, in terms of power and control, it's like a focal point. There are certain tactics that individuals who in the relationship will try to use, such as emotional abuse, intimidation, using the children, economic abuse, physical and sexual violence, intimidation. So things like, if you leave me, you will never see the kids again. Why are you always going out? You're a bad parent. If you leave me, I will report you to public health. So it's using different tactics to maintain power in the relationship.
I also want to add too, as we've been talking, how violence occurs at multiple levels, right? And so we've been just talking now how this power and control can be exhibited, from one person to another in a kind of a couple context, in a family context. It's also important for us to also look at how power and control acts at the community level, at the society level, right? And when we think about, again, this is where kind of like my experience in like violence against women and gender-based violence comes from, right? So when we think about power and control, and we think about who has power and control in our community and in our society, we see that those in power are the ones who are perpetrating violence. In general, again, this is not to say that this is always the case, right? But then we see, how that kind of gets enacted, again, at the societal level, and then as we were talking just now, at the like more individual and family level.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, can we really change anything when so many of the mental health professionals are outsiders? So it looks like this person is asking about kind of like the mental health scene on Guam. So there, could you speak to this? Is this a dilemma? Are predominantly the mental health professionals not from within the community? And what are some ways that that might be changing?
Go ahead.
Yes, it's true, right? That predominantly in the mental health field, we are modeled, our treatment and interventions are modeled with Western curriculums, right? But we are able to, when it comes to treatment, it has to be client-centered, right? And again, you have the client and their beliefs are dictated by their belief systems, which come from our culture, right? So you have to incorporate in as creative ways as you can cultural means of intervention, right? But it's definitely challenging, right? When a lot of our curriculums have to be evidence-based practices, right? That are not, we don't have any at this point, any moral cultural evidence-based practices, right? So if we do, Dr. Santos and I have reviewed like the COA, right? So we try our best to look at other indigenous-based curriculums or other Pacific Islander curriculums to kind of meet our needs.
And if I may, so the fact right now we have quite a few providers right on this call, and some of them getting their doctorate, but also they're working licensed folks. We need to take control over our own training. We want to have interns, practicum students, and also give them that opportunity. When I was in grad school, That was back in 97. I was the only Chamorro, or in the whole school, and they didn't even know what Chamorro was. So we've come a long ways, but we have a long ways to go. And right now, as a group, I think it's very exciting that we have a collective now, folks that are educated, but also are committed, and we're bringing the next generation up. And we've already laid the foundation, and slowly but surely, I'd like to see an APA internship here. Wouldn't that be something? Or even be able to provide a whole rotation for people instead of having to go all the way off island just to go to school. I mean, we can do that. We don't really need to have all this the validation, because we already validated ourselves.
And if I may just quickly add to that, all of our providers who are practicing in the community, they're licensed, and based on their license, every license that they subscribe to, there is an ethical responsibility to make room or to take into account multicultural diversity, inclusivity type of issues. In addition, multicultural counseling is it's a regular course in behavioral health and in mental health practices. And the final point I want to make is, yes, most of our curriculum is Western based, but as a practitioner, there are certain alterations you can make to make it more culturally appropriate. So for example, in the men's group, we do introductions. It can be in their various languages. We talk about where they come from, if they have a family name. And we talk about their own family healing practices or their own cultural healing practices as part of the group curriculum that we use, and in some of the domestic violence groups that we have out in the community. So I think that's that a lot of all the practitioners that I know who are in the community, they're licensed, they have training in multiculturalism, multicultural counseling, and we are bound ethically to include that in our practice. Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing. Actually, because a lot of the time you had mentioned kind of indigenous practices and even Chamorro culture and kind of how we relate to each other, we got quite a few questions about, are there indigenous ways of dealing with the pandemic? And a lot of that came from that people feel that the virus is sort of tearing us apart because we can't really see our families in the way we used to. And that makes it very difficult for us to sort of social distance and be apart from each other. So they also wanted to know, is there an indigenous form of therapy within our Chamorro culture? And then someone also wanted to know about Native Americans and if there were tribal practices. And I know Dr. Santos, you had mentioned one earlier about the feeling of the soul and kind of the circular way of thinking. So I know that's quite a lot in that one question, but I think with the pandemic, people are kind of wondering if there are ways to do this kind of within our cultural framework.
Yeah, it's really changing the dynamic of how we're able to relate to each other, right? That's a really good question, right? Culturally, how we express ourselves isn't only through physical touch. It isn't only through, that's a large part of it, that kind of affection. But we also have those really cold Chamorro nanas that don't, they're not very physically affectionate, right? Or they don't say, I love you, right? So there are other ways more practical ways that are actually very cultural for us that we can show affection, right? And that's by, if I see an elder at Payless and, they're getting down from their car, offering to take their list inside, right? And buy their food for them, right? Dropping flowers to your grandma and just putting it outside, right? Just other ways to show that you're present, right? That you love them and that you're thinking of them, right? Give them a call, right? So we are very dynamic, and you know, we've survived so much already. You know, we've survived Spanish influenza, we've survived, gosh, all those wars we talked about and that we listed, right? We're definitely resilient, and you know, if you miss your Nana, give her a call, or you know, there are other means and other ways to do it without actually physically touching your loved ones, right, for their safety.
I spoke with one of the elders, Richard Mooskamp, this morning from Guam, the Pine Ridge, where we have a ceremony. This year, they didn't have Sundance, but he told me they were going to have Sundance next year. But they're going to do kind of like a Western twist to it. We're going to have to be quarantined for 14 days after. So it's kind of incorporating. He said they're still having ceremony. They're having the lodges or the inipis and the other things that are still going on. And interesting enough, they've been able to work through it and still keep their social distancing. So he just said that right now there's a lot of difficulties. There's a lot, the suicide is about as high as Guam right now, and there's a lot of unemployment, but the ceremony is still able to occur. And you know, I was kidding him. I said, well, can we do it on Zoom? And he goes, well, we'll have to look that up. But I want to just say that they're continuing on, and he said it will always be there. You know, it'll be there next year and the year after.
All right, thank you. So we got a bunch of questions actually about how to have this conversation. So I'm just going to kind of do a combination of a few of these really great questions that came in. Some people had asked, I believe so much in this message, and I am grateful that someone is having this conversation. But when I've tried to talk to my family about how important this is, they shut down. How can we translate this to something I can put into my family chat? We have a difficult time talking about these things because of shame, right? Another person said, my father isn't a war survivor, but born in the 50s. He has trouble expressing himself and talking about what he's feeling. This talk about intergenerational trauma makes me wonder how much it might be something passed down from generation to generation. He was also in the Air Force for a short period. How do we break this cycle of, you know, not being able to talk about this? And then another person, again, brought up how difficult it is talking about these things, and that sometimes in their family, talking about it further traumatizes them. So how do they then approach this infection of spirit, as they called it? And then one more, still related, was, what are better models of conflict resolution if so many times our families just sweep these issues under the rug, or even just cancel people? So I think what we're getting a lot of people wondering about is that we actually don't talk about these things. There isn't really a way sort of within our families that we make space as is being discussed. And so how can we break that cycle? What are some ways that the people listening today can try new approaches with either their family or friends so that these things don't just get swept under the rug?
I could start the conversation, and I'm sure Cam and Terry and Dr. Santos can jump in. You know, it really does depend on the topic of conversation. There's certain things you just don't put on your chat room, your family chat room. When speaking with somebody who is older or what have you, instead of asking them directly, you know, you start with asking them about their life story. You know, tell me about, you know, how it was growing up. You know, and you can start there. What was your most fond memories of, you know, of childhood? You know, that kind of stuff. It's really connecting at their level, and it's also, and if that, you know, if that might be too difficult to do, you know, of course, other things is, you know, we socialize around food. And bring food, you know, go to your parents' house, your grandparents' house, just bring food, and, you know, and it could be a food from our own culture, or it could be a new recipe. And it's something, that you can start a conversation with, but ask them about them, and you're listening to understand. I think that's the concept. You're actively listening, and you're really listening to the nonverbals and what they're not saying. And for some people, speaking about like the war or speaking about their trauma can be very traumatic for them. And they've learned over time that, they've learned to be silent, or that silence was their way of coping, because it opens up a lot of wounds. And so I was teaching a class at the university, and I believed it was, it's like an individual practice class. And one of their assignments was to ask their parents just a set of questions. And you'd be shocked at the number of people who did not know, some of the experiences that their parents had gone through. And I had one particular student who said, I didn't know that my dad, underwent this type of trauma. I mean, that makes sense. I understand his silence. I understand, why he is the way he is, and it may not have resolved the issue of her having, this person having a better conversation with her parent, but she understood, and she, and it wasn't about her. It was just his way of surviving and coping. And that's okay too. I'm talking about difficult issues. Of course, it's going to be very difficult, but if you can just start with connecting and just making that connection, because we are pretty quick at finding our differences. But, culturally, we have more commonality is a big thing. And you want to find that first, and you want to be supportive. And that's how I believe, that's how you can start those conversations.
Thank you. I'm sure that's something that a lot of our families struggle with. I mean, that's why when we talk about the Archdiocese cases, I mean, it took decades for a lot of people to even feel comfortable enough to sort of say anything because of the time in which they grew up. And so a lot of our families are sort of struggling with that. And so a couple of participants wanted to ask about suicide. And so one said, suicide is like an epidemic here. Can I hear more specifics on how this can help us deal with that? And then someone asked specifically about former Governor Ricky Berdalio, and they were saying that he's very visible in our island's history. And so they're wondering if that sort of sends a different message or sort of wrong message around the issue of suicide. So if any of you can speak to that.
Okay, so one of the things is we have probably one of the highest suicide rates per capita, right, on Guam. It's very similar to the reservation. Part of it now is to find our healing within ourselves first, even as providers, to know that we're able to feel good. And we probably had suicides in our own families, and then as we work, we help other people in our community. With Mr. Berdalio, I read about him before I became to Guam, and I'm not even I'm not even sure it was a suicide. I don't want to get political, but I'm just thinking that there's a lot of context that we have to look at here. And the person that committed suicide, they're giving us some kind of message, and part of our job is to find out what that message was in a non-judgmental way. And we work with suicide prevention, but whatever that message is that they're trying to convey to us is really going to take us to the next part of our lives. And again, it's one of those things. I don't think the suicide rate has changed since I've been here. I've been on Guam for 15 years, and I don't think it's changed. If not, it's gotten worse with the pandemic. And so that is something that we, as a group, as a collective, we need to look at, really deeply and figure out what has worked and what's going to make a difference for our community.
I want to add to that. I think we've been talking about this, and Dr. Santos might have mentioned this too, that high suicide rates are actually very common in other indigenous communities too. So high rates of violence, high rates of suicide, right? And so I think it also goes back to the sense of cultural loss. I think it comes back to feeling disempowered, right? As indigenous peoples who don't have that self-sovereignty, right? And if we think about that example of Bordallo, when we think about our legend of the two lovers jumping off, right, Two Lovers Point, right? These are kind of responses to being disempowered by a society that, yeah, will not allow us to be and not allow us to have that power, right? So I think that's also another thing to think about, right? Not necessarily something maybe we can address like in a therapy room, but this is where we got to think as a community, right? What are we going to do to empower ourselves? What are our groups like Independent Guåhan and the Finogi Coalition, right, coming together to address these broader social issues so that we can make this change.
I'm just going to briefly add to that. You know, in terms of suicide, you can come, you know, from the best of families, you know, and you can raise your kids the right way or, you know, with a love and attention. And one day they can just impulsively take their lives. And it's very tragic, and it's very tragic for all involved, especially the families. And we ask ourselves, you know, did we not see the signs? Did we miss the signs? You know, and I assure you that sometimes there are no signs, you know, but I think Dr. Napati, you talked about, you know, having that difficult conversation. You know, if you have an adolescent who you know, may feel like he or she is rejected because of her lifestyle or, you know, or her choices that she's made in life, I mean, that's huge, you know. So you know, I think one of the biggest things really is, you know, accepting your kids and, you know, having unconditional positive regard, being inclusive, you know, and just respecting our differences. And if there's one thing I can say about Governor Bordallo, you know, I think I was in 1990, I was a senior in high school, and I went to the People's First March, and I want to remember him for the good he did for our island, and not for one incident that had occurred. He had done so much good for our people and for our island, and for that I will honor him. You know, thank you. Thanks for this. Thanks for asking these difficult questions, right? Because this is the forum to talk about it, right? So thanks a lot for that.
Thank you. So the next combination of questions is really going to focus on culture and trying to unpack more how we can use culture in our approaches. One person pointed out that, you know, first we may be able to learn about some of these traumas in things like our legends, right? How can we look at our stories and our legends to see what kinds of traumas occurred in our legends? So the reference, for example, to Two Lovers was wonderful because, you know, not only what is the trauma that occurred, but also what was the response, right? And is that useful, or has it been useful in some of your approaches to therapy? And then others brought up things like perhaps our indigenous practices such as chanting, weaving, fishing, song, etc., are some positive strategies that could work. One person particularly has a question for Ms. Terry. She says, regarding culturally responsive behavioral health treatment, can you talk about your incorporation of indigenous chant into your curriculum at Guam Behavioral Wellness Center? And then, you know, finally, somebody also brought in the idea that approaches such as restorative justice borrow from indigenous cultures, and would that work here? So kind of in summary, like maybe we can start with Terry, since the question was really directed to her. How does indigenous chant and then also other things, other cultural practices, stories, help us to find some of these answers that we're seeking?
So the indigenous, the Chamorro chant group therapy curriculum that I had created and implemented at Guam Behavioral Health for a few years. And I also still incorporate some of those aspects into my work with veterans here at the Vet Center. Does start off with evaluating some of our legends, right? So it really is, if you look at trauma, it's how they interpret the story of the violence that occurred to them, right? So it's about restoring identity and recreating more empowering stories of the self, of the collective, right? And that is done through the revisiting and retelling of more empowering stories, right? So stories like the women who saved Guam from the giant fish, right? So that demonstrates our collective and our problem solving as women to bind together and to save our island, right? And that demonstrates such strength and resilience that we have. And within that curriculum, there's also chant, right? So we do learn some Chamorro chants, we sing them, and that is a very powerful form of healing, right? Because it's a way that we don't have to just use talk therapy, right? Because sometimes, like we've talked about, there's a lot of silence because there's a lot of stigma around just sitting and talking about your problems, especially to people that are outside of your family, your immediate family, right? So that's a way around that shame is singing, right? So Kantan Chamarita is definitely a traditional Chamorro intervention to deal with conflict and dispute, right? So it's a very indirect way of dealing with your intense emotions and singing it and being very playful about it, right? So play is also a very cultural mechanism to deal with anger and emotions that are painful, right? We play and we cassie and we tease, right? And that in a Western sense is sort of translated to bullying, right? But it traditionally and culturally, it really isn't, right? It's more of an indirect way to resolve our conflicts and our disagreements and our disputes, right? So being very playful, teasing, and singing, right? So singing, so the chants allow for a space to achieve this, right, in therapy, right? So I know there is a lot of other things in the question.
Really quickly, so someone just listening right now specifically pointed out that a recent suicide was the result of someone who had succumbed to the pressure of not being able to pay their rent or their bills. And so this person was specifically responding to you, asking, how does indigenous chant help people who can't afford rent during the pandemic, which causes them the kind of stress to the degree of committing suicide?
Yeah. So if we look at suicide, we're looking at an immediate very distressful moment, right? And so to deal with suicide, we have to restore our sense of interconnection to our families and to each other, right? So that when we feel desperate and very emotionally dysregulated and distressed, we can reach out to someone in that moment that we feel safe and we trust, right? But suicide is, it's temporary and it's fleeting, right? So if you're able to have a person reach out to you in that moment, you reduce their chance of harming themselves, right? And of course, it's not just chanting, right? There are different, that's just one mechanism of treatment and healing, right? So if again, we look at risk factors and we look at how vulnerable and how sick our community is, right? Collectively, right? And like we said earlier, we're probably going to have higher rates this year because of COVID, because we are more vulnerable as a community during the pandemic, right? And again, it's about reconnecting our families, right? So, you know, the other day I did my aunt's unemployment application, right? Because she didn't have access to a computer, right? So, you know, stuff like that, right? So it's about traditional values of being there, just being there, right? And having trust and love for your friends and your families.
And just to piggyback, the stronger a person's cultural kind of beliefs or their cultural background will be, the stronger they're going to be able to cope with adversity. So I worked at a clinic where we brought in, you know, spiritual people that were from, you know, different reservations, and they worked with the folks, and they had their ceremonies, and it was very successful because in the urban setting they didn't have access to those ceremonies, and they were able to learn and relearn. And again, within that small group or within that clinic, it was a very low suicide rate, very good, you know, efficacy with treatment and decreased substance abuse. And that was because people were proud and were able to learn about their traditions. And not to say you have to go around, you know, wear eagle feathers in your hair and stuff, but the point is to understand where you came from. And it's not about shame, and it's not about, you know, this whole trauma. It's a very proud tradition of ceremony.
Thank you for the response. I know a lot of people do try to connect sort of what we do culturally with ways to heal. And so you all gave really great examples of legends we can use, chants. I really love the idea of Kantan Chamarita, because I mean, that was the whole purpose of it, was to get us to communicate openly and without like kind of directly, I guess, going after each other, right? Like we didn't do it as in an attack kind of way. And so this next question kind of speaks to generational transmission. So someone was talking about, can you relate the seemingly large number of aspiring generational drug dealers to colonization, Vietnam, capitalism, and our people's history as farmers? And so this person was saying that many of the people around them sort of grew up with parents who lived in Guam at the time when we were shifting from sort of an agricultural economy to a now more wage-based one. And so they picked up those skills around sort of growing marijuana and other things. And so they felt that growing up in this way kind of translated into them having the same aspirations as their parents. So I guess they kind of want to see where sort of all these historical moments and shifts sort of blend into what ends up happening when we kind of grow up with these things around us.
I'll start, then hopefully Cam, Terry, and Doc jump in. I will say this as sensitively as I possibly can. You know, sometimes the shoe does not fit, you know, so we are training or educating some of our people to fill jobs that it's not something that they can do, or it's not something that they are passionate about. And things like farming or fishing or, you know, those type of jobs are, you know, I want to say with, in the last generation or two, right? I mean, it's not, those are not type of jobs that are embraced, you know, and economically, at the end of the day, you know, we have to feed our families. And so, you know, I mean, I am a product of the educational system. So, you know, our folks are very pro-education because they didn't have an education, you know, and then the generation after me, you know, I'm trying to push education and it doesn't fit, you know, it doesn't fit for everyone. You know, I have family members who, you know, like I have a nephew who wants to work, you know, with his hands, or he wants to do other things, and that society frowns upon to some extent. I mean, I'm guilty of it too. You know, I'm pro-education, and it's like trying to fit him into he's a square peg trying to fit into a round hole. And I've had to reevaluate, and I've had to take a step back, and I've had to say, well, what works for you, and how can I help you achieve that?
Having worked with quite a few drug dealers, what has helped them is to make that transition to their economic kind of betterment. They're pretty good business people. So if you're able to teach them that they can use those skills to work in society. And then the other way around, I had actually one person off island who was well educated, became a drug dealer just because it was so lucrative. In fact, he had an MBA. So I think it's economics, but also teaching them to understand that there are ways that they can learn to make that kind of money with the skills that they have. I mean, I'm not going to say drug dealing is, but it is lucrative, but it also, it takes a lot of skills. It's creative. It takes a lot of understanding of economics too. So I think it's part of it. We lost our agricultural base, so they didn't have a way to make money, so they go to dealing drugs. It's easier, it's quicker, faster.
And in addition to the economics, a lot of individuals who I've worked with, who either use drugs, they use it as a form of coping, and it is a disorder, and they use it as a form of healing, to kind of like cope from pain. And we understand that, there's really no cure for drug addiction, but there are ways to manage it. And one of the most important ways, of course, is family and maintaining that connection, and despite what's going on and what your loved one is going through, you want to show love and support as much as you can, because, that helps. And of course, treatment works. It helps with the management. But there are a lot of reasons that have contributed to the drug epidemic that we have, especially with the new drugs that are now on the streets. So we're seeing a lot more things on the streets that are very, very concerning. But, like what Dr. Santos had mentioned, there are ways that we can heal, or there are ways that we can manage and address the issues. But it's going to take all of us, and it really does take a lot of family support. Even though you want to shut that door, you got to keep it open. Thank you.
Thank you. So just in the interest of time, we're going to just ask one more question. I had some thoughts that do lead into this question, just responding to what Dr. Baza just shared. So one of the questions I had referenced earlier was about restorative justice being rooted in indigenous practice. And, for those that don't know what restorative justice is, it's really working as a community to respond to a crime, right? So instead of just sort of simple crime and punishment, one particular model of this that we actually featured in an Independent Guåhan General Assembly before was from a Native community in Canada that took a circle approach where they would actually look at who the victim and perpetrator were and create a circle around them of all of the loved ones connected to them that could help them to come up with a just form of restitution for what had happened, but also continue to coexist, because many of the times victims and perpetrators are in the same family, sometimes even in the same household. And so then just arresting somebody, repeatedly arresting, and then they come out and come back into the family, but no healing has occurred, no restitution has occurred between the individuals and the family members connected to them, just continues to lead to these cycles. But unfortunately, these are things that, in many places have to be written into law. I know that for us, we have restorative justice for our juvenile court system, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, if there is this in the adult court system as well. But for the most part, just as an observer, someone who just really religiously reads, a lot of times it seems that our community, it's really a crime and punishment type of scenario. And yet a lot of the violent crime in our community is connected to drugs, and there isn't treatment for that root cause, or, you know, what you're sharing now, right? And so it really means that, especially when we're thinking about the possibilities of independence and sovereignty, that even as a community, in framing our laws, in framing our constitution, we have to think about what is justice, right? Is it simply crime and punishment? Or do we approach justice in a way that ensures that people don't continue to get arrested, or people don't continue to become victims of violence, right? Because the root cause of that violence was never addressed, right? Or the healing that needed to occur never did. And so a few people asked about leaders, and if, you know, that given that it's an election year, do any of you know of leaders who have taken these approaches through the law to really try to change things? And if you could recommend some, or even speak to some laws or local leaders that have really tried to address these issues. But also, how do we continue to approach our leaders? What are some creative ways that we can currently change the law to work better for us?
I'll start. You know, so the courts, you know, under the leadership of Chief Justice Phil Carbolito, has integrated therapeutic courts. So, you know, we have the juvenile drug courts, we have the family court or family drug court, we have the vet courts, we have the adult drug court. And so, although crime and punishment seems to be a theme of the past, what drug courts do really, it does the opposite. It provides treatment and case management. It provides drug testing. They help with housing referrals and transportation issues, education. The adult drug court was started, I believe, in 2003, and I was working there. I was their drug court coordinator for a couple of years. And that's a lot of what we did. You know, it was individualized interventions and treatments, and support groups, and rec therapy type of groups, and social type of groups. We did a basket weaving class. I mean, there are different ways of approaching this. And so I want to say that currently, you know, we are taking a therapeutic approach, and with the courts, they've worked very hard to implement a lot of these programs, and our Chief Justice has been an integral part of this process, you know. So I hope that answered that particular question. The second half of it, I mean, I don't want to talk about politics. I'm going to leave that to somebody else. But I do understand, like with the vet court, that bill was introduced by former Senator Frank Uggan, who's no longer in office. And so, of course, he was given credit for that particular legislation. Thank you very much.
I want to talk about
A little bit. And with the vet court, that's under Judge Cezanne right now. Veterans that have a diagnosis that was the result of their war experience are given an opportunity to go through treatment to get their cases dismissed and a lot of times expunged. So it's a 2-year process. However, a lot of times we have like a 90% graduation rate, which is really incredible, because these folks, when given one opportunity and kind of tell them this is your mission and this is what's expected of you, they rise to the occasion. So it's very successful. I feel that we can incorporate more into that. We can incorporate the families into the vet court and bring them as part, like that restorative justice, you know, so they can meet their spouses, especially if we have some of those family violence cases. But again, you're right. Indigenous thinking was restorative justice, you know, a long time before it became this buzzword that we're using now.
I wanted to add that I think related to this question and related to this general idea of trauma we're talking about, a lot of organizations have moved toward trauma-informed care, right? And so that's also another buzzword, right? So there's some problems with buzzwords, but I think it's another way of looking at people and looking at communities and acknowledging the different histories of trauma that people endure, right? And so we're not treating people as these kind of empty shells that don't have these histories, right? We're acknowledging that trauma and we're moving forward in a way that won't re-traumatize people. And so I don't know who is kind of promoting that, but I think maybe that's a question we could ask our leaders, like how are you promoting trauma-informed care? How are you promoting trauma-informed practices in your legislation?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, all of you. We went a little bit over time, so I appreciate you giving us more of your time and your thoughts. We tried our best to bring all the questions in. I'm sorry if we weren't able to directly answer a specific question you may have had in the audience, but we hope this is a continuing conversation in our community. And I'm glad that people were wondering about how to engage leadership, because I think that if you take these questions to people that can really change these policies and make a difference, I think that's a really great way to start. You know, and we are just so excited to have such a community conversation. I'm really grateful for everything that I learned today. We're going to continue to look at issues impacting our community. And so, as I mentioned in the beginning, our next General Assembly will be on the last Thursday of this month, September 24th, and we'll be looking at how we care for our manamku. So, you know, in this time of COVID, we have to acknowledge that those who we value for their wisdom and their lives are being most affected. And so we really want to look at how we've been caring for our manamku and how we can do better. So thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you again to our distinguished guests and presenters. And we hope to continue this dialogue and see you at the end of the month. Hasta Dios.